Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. A bit of a hard task to follow Luke Bowen. He's always a pretty polished presenter, but I'll do my best. I'm honoured to be the first cab off the rank of returning scholar presentations, and it's great to be back in the NT, which is a place where my wife and I have called home, and can see a few familiar faces. So I hope my presentation today will be of interest and hopefully spark a little bit of healthy discussion and debate. Just before I dive in, I'd like to acknowledge and thank my scholarship sponsor, the Northern Territory Department of Primary Industry and Resource, for investing in myself and Nuffield. At the time of receiving my scholarship, I was a Territorian and had been for some time, and although I now call Queensland home, I'm very grateful for the funding, and I'd like to formally recognise the foresight of the decision makers within the department and the wider government. I hope they continue to see value in sponsoring Nuffield scholars now and into the future, at a time when there's so much discussion and focus on developing primary industry in the north. I'll do a bit of background on ourselves. I'd also just like to thank my wife, Jack, for her support throughout this. Like most things I do these days, I can't seem to do it without her, so the Nuffield Scholarship's been no different. As David touched on, we operate a beef trading and breeding enterprise on 2,500 hectares on the central coast of Queensland. We've only had the property about 16 months, so we're still finding our feet in what is a bit of a different environment than we're used to. In fact, we managed to get early occupancy of the property prior to settlement, and moved onto the place 10 days before I departed for 7 weeks on my Global Focus program. We were living in a caravan as the house was uninhabitable. I bought a tank and had some drinking water delivered, managed to get a toilet flushing and was gone. What more could a woman possibly want? Prior to moving to Queensland, Jack and I had lived and worked across the Kimberley and the Northern Territory for around 10 years, mainly in corporate cattle station management positions before building our own cattle under several different lease and adjustment scenarios. We're first-generation farmers, and we're now realising our long-held goal of owning and operating our own land and all the challenges that brings. I'm going to cover a few different topics this morning. Throughout my Nuffield travel, I deliberately tried not to narrow my focus to any one particular theme, and rather tried to look at extensive beef production as a whole. I also have a bit of a short attention span, as some of my fellow travellers would attest, so maybe there's a bit of that in there. But my presentation today really has two parts. One, how we can more positively influence our native grazing environments, and two, how we might approach further development and intensification. I derive my study topics from the fascination I've always had of trying to constantly improve production and associate a return from our land assets, whilst growing the capital value of that asset. I set out to find environments similar to Northern Australia, as I have a belief that some of the smartest operators in the beef sector come from these more extensive and often fairly harsh environments where it's not all laid out on a platter for you. As a direct result, these people need to be very smart and strategic about the way they operate, as there are many challenges along the road to profitability. But on the upside, there's also significant potential gain due to the multiplying factors of operating on such a large scale. As first-generation entrants into the beef sector, we, like many, are faced with the familiar scenario of operating in an environment where the entry costs are substantial, whether that be livestock or land, so we need to be really smart about what we invest in and the way in which we operate our business. Just to continue on my study topics, as time goes on, I'm sure there's going to be a natural progression towards smaller, more intensively managed beef cattle businesses as population pressure increases and people are forced to look outside the box to expand their farming ventures. I'm a conventional person by nature, but I'm always very interested in how different people are tackling similar problems. When we look at the management of our resources, whether that be soil, water or grass, there often seems to be two paths we can take, one of conventional farming practice and one of more alternative biological method. And a consistent theme throughout my travels seemed to be a blend of these two ideals. People are taking both conventional and alternative methods and applying them to their individual situations to find the best solutions to their production issues. In this context, I chose to look at the historical use of our rangeland environments on a domestic and international scale to see what effect we had had by utilising these areas for beef cattle production. What can we learn from the past 100 years or so of grazing in these areas? How do we address the problems that in many ways we have created, and what are the prospects for productivity improvements in extensive beef production environments? One big issue we're faced with is woody encroachment and thickening. Whether this be mesquite in Texas, gidgee in central western Queensland, or woody vegetation in savanna environments such as many parts of northern Australia, there seems to be a definite trend that woody plants are thickening and encroaching and negatively impacting grass production. Just threw this slide in as an example. This is a property in central west Queensland. This shows some satellite imagery over a 61-year period from 1951 to 2012, and I think you can clearly see there's a fair amount of woody encroachment in this example. Due to the many variabilities in these environments, it's hard to pinpoint exactly what's causing this. However, discussion seems to centre around overgrazing, different or a lack of burning regimes, and as well as our general desire for monocultures when it comes to our grazing lands. I was very fortunate to spend some time in southern Texas with the Natural Resource and Conservation Service, who operate under the USDA. Here they are battling woody plant encroachment on highly productive, predominantly black soil open grasslands, very similar to parts of central western Queensland and northern Australia. Through the NRCS, local landholders are tackling woody weed encroachment with a prescribed regime of aerial spraying and controlled burns. NRCS, based in Victoria, Texas, have come up with a 3-year management program which they believe has proved to be the best combination of cost-effective treatment methods. The key learning for me here, though, had nothing to do with their particular control methods, as these may be specific to their environment and not ours. What was interesting is the approach they're taking. Driven by some key people within NRCS, the focus is on an increase in grass production as the key determinant of success, rather than the reduction in woody plant viability or percentage reduction in canopy. They've recognised they don't fully understand the reasons for woody encroachment, and the control methods to date have been largely ineffective or have failed. By focusing on grass production rather than trying to totally eliminate woody plants from their environment, local beef producers are finding that grass production can still be more than adequate to meet their grazing needs under a reduced woody canopy. Just moving on to fire management. In relation to woody plant control, fire is a key tool that's been used for years. Many in the north, and indeed this room, are pretty well versed with various fire regimes, some controlled, some not so much. In the context of savanna environments, such as much of northern Australia, historically fires would have been ignited during the build-up and early storms prior to the onset of the wet. In more recent human history, there's been a distinct trend of igniting early dry season fires for hunting and grazing purposes. More recently, fire hazard reduction as conducted on an annual basis by our authorities and national parks, and some of the early carbon abatement schemes such as Luke touched on. I've often wondered whether these changes in burning methods might be one reason why we're seeing woody encroachment and thickening of our rangelands, and what effect this might be having on our biodiversity from the subsoil up, and there's plenty of research available around this. When early burning is combined with grazing, this can, over a relatively short period of time, result in a change in plant composition in localised areas through overgrazing of palatable plants when they're at their most vulnerable. In the instance of traditional set stocking, which is still the norm in much of northern Australia, burnt areas can be preferentially grazed for years to come, again resulting in overgrazing and ultimately risking the removal of desirable perennial grasses from the system. Flowering of most woody plants in northern Australia also occurs in the dry season, and seed set from these plants may increase given the favourable competition factors created by early dry season burning. I just threw this one in here because I thought it was a good example of where you can go on your Nuffield experience, and here I was setting fire to Texas, which I thought was pretty neat, but it's all out now. So, grazing management. I'll touch briefly on grazing management. I'm aware there's a great deal of information out there regarding set stocking versus rotational grazing, and there are people who have differing opinions and beliefs right across the production scale. So whilst I didn't set out to study grazing management in a rangeland context, this is obviously one of, if not the most important variabilities in how we manage our pastures through differing levels of grazing pressure and the degree to which we allow our pastures to rest and recover to ensure their ongoing survival. The increase of undesirable fodder species such as broadleaf and specified weed grasses or less palatable native grasses is also an ongoing concern in native grazing environments and has a negative impact on animal production as well as associated return on investment. Again, the basic principles of grazing management apply here, and yet for some reason right across the world, and including our northern beef sectors, there are numerous examples of this not being applied. If we don't build adequate pasture rest into our grazing regimes, we'll continue to overgraze desirable, more palatable species, resulting in less seed set and ultimately the extinction of these plants from our paddocks. The common theme in all of these issues discussed is our soil. Whilst our ability to alter our soil attributes may be somewhat more limited in an extensive environment, we shouldn't underestimate the impact we're having on water and associated nutrient infiltration, organic matter, carbon sequestration and biodiversity in our soils through simple management techniques regarding grazing, fire and the resulting makeup of plant species. In addition to doing what we can to support and improve our native environments, I looked at different development strategies internationally. Along the theme of grass and intensifying production, I was fortunate enough to spend a week in Mato Grosso in central Brazil. Despite them having a notoriously disorganised and corrupt government system, I found that their National Agricultural Agency, Embrapa, was very well respected by agricultural producers across many different sectors. Of interest to me, the department seemed to be very progressive in developing high-yielding C4 grass species to suit their tropical environments. C4 plants being those that are suited to hot and at times dry climates and produce a lot of energy. Here I found several different hybrid species that have been developed in recent years and were in use across all the areas I visited in Brazil. The only real difference between here and Mato Grosso was their higher rainfall. It struck me that there was a very big emphasis placed on intensifying production from their land assets. I would attribute this mainly to population pressure and also the relative low cost of labour. Many of the extensive grazing environments that I saw in Brazil were treated more like a cropping enterprise with high-yielding pasture crops, often sown in rotation with other crop varieties such as soybeans and sugarcane. Having said that, I also found a lot of improved grass in less arable country, and outside of specific conservation areas didn't see much in the way of native grasses. If I relate these scenarios back to Australia, I can see huge opportunity to intensify production across large tracts in northern Australia through the use of high-vigour tropical grass varieties that would in many cases be replacing degraded, underperforming or less desirable native pastures. Our governments have a role to play in this, as we need to continue to address the inevitable trade-off between environmental regulation and production of the north, and development of the north, sorry. One example of this would be the introduction of gamba grass, the top end in the 1930s, as a pasture species. Gamba grass is from the Poaceae family, I hope I got that right, from which the likes of Embrapa in Brazil have developed several very successful hybrid species in recent years. Gamba only requires a minimum of 600 mil of rain and grows in soils with very low fertility, as can be seen anywhere north of Katherine here in the NT. We need to be very mindful that competitor countries such as Brazil are willing to utilise and further improve production of these high-yielding grass species for the betterment of their cattle industries, when in Australia we declare them a Class A weed of national significance. Extensive grazing environments in the future. Having had the opportunity to travel to over 10 different countries during my Nuffield Scholarship, it's reinforced my belief that in our northern beef production sector we have the potential for huge intensification of our operations. Much focus has been placed on genetic improvement within northern cattle herds in recent decades, with a big trend towards breeding cattle to better suit the generally harsh environment. This has been an obvious shortcoming to address, and we can have great improvement over a relatively short period of time in this regard. On the flip side of this, the old saying goes that 90% of what we put down in animals, 90% of an animal's genetics is what we put down its throat. I believe that investment to improve our land assets through the likes of further fencing and water development, subdivision and improved pastures should have been given as high a priority as improving our genetics. It makes sense to breed cattle to suit our environment, but it also makes sense to develop our environment better to suit our cattle where we can. We've been receiving record prices for a couple of years now, so hopefully there's a bit of surplus cash available amongst beef producers to do just this. There are some great examples of development and intensification within our beef industry in northern Australia. Beetaloo Station is one case of a bid to better utilise our native grasslands on a large scale, and I see similar development underway at Walhollow and their other assets. The Douglas Daly region is probably a little bit more indicative of what I found in the likes of Brazil, with its improved pastures and diversified crops, grown on what is essentially pretty marginal soil. Referring back to my study topics, my study objectives around management practices and intensification, we need to strive to better understand the physical environment around us and the impact we can have in both positive and negative ways through managing our land assets. There seems to be a global shift towards incorporating regenerative, I think Richard had trouble with that last night, farming practices, no matter what commodity you look at, as we've seen some conventional inputs becoming less effective. We underestimate our impact on the landscape, especially in extensive grazing environments. What we may now accept as being normal certainly won't have always been the case. As we are starting to see distinct increases in the aforementioned problems, we need to continue to experiment to find solutions. In Australia, we're spoilt for choice when it comes to farming land, so the norm is often to buy out the neighbour or look elsewhere to grow our asset base. While scale can be achieved purely through buying more land, it can also be achieved through development of existing assets to increase our turnover and hopefully our profit, arguably with less costs and lower levels of debt. The generally large size of beef producing assets in Northern Australia has, I believe, historically attracted many investors who have had capital gain as their number one priority over and above increasing production efficiencies within their investment. There are many forms of development and intensification, and these may be as simple as understanding our environment better and trying alternative approaches to deal with issues such as woody encroachment or invasive, undesirable plants, or we can invest in further subdivision, fencing and pasture improvement. In closing, we need to continue to develop our leadership within Northern Beef and the wider agricultural community. Of all the countries I've been fortunate enough to visit, we seem to have the least voice and the least clout when we try to express our concerns. Many of our politicians have lost touch or don't care about how difficult it's become to operate in a high capital, low cash flow business such as beef. I can vouch for this personally when I reflect on the hard and at times almost impossible path to land ownership, much less building a profitable beef business with limited funding. We're amongst the lowest cost beef producers in the world, but I would question whether that is where we always want to target. The North will intensify, and it's happening as we speak. One thing for sure is that if we're to remain viable and, more importantly, prosperous into the future, we need to continue to think outside the box and reinvest our capital in a strategic manner. And I, for one, am certainly looking forward to seeing what the Northern beef industry will look like in years to come. Thanks.